Now, start webinar
All right, you're live.
and record. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National Biodiversity Teach-In. This morning we have Bonnie Hamilton, and she's going to be talking to us about microplastics in the changing north. Thank you, Bonnie, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and we'll get started. All right, so I am an ecotoxicologist and a PhD researcher at the University of Toronto. And today I will be talking about the Arctic and the threats it faces. So first, I want to acknowledge and thank the organizers of the National Biodiversity Teach-In for organizing this event and continuing to host it. It is an excellent platform for science communication and education, and I'm honored to be a part of it again this year. Firstly, I want to start today with acknowledging two regions I have had the pleasure of growing up in, which have fostered my sense of place. These are the places that have ultimately led me to be involved in research and conservation to protect the wild places I hold near and dear to my heart. I'm a product of Northern Michigan, and the Great Lakes are my home. My other home is Northern Arizona. My little alpine town was integrated onto Apache land and next to the Navajo Nation. My dad worked for the Indian Health Service and worked very closely with these two tribes, as well as the Hopi people. And I went frequently to work with him as a kid, and people of these great three nations always welcomed me. So these two places have one thing in common. They put the grandeur of our environment into perspective, and they make us feel really small, and I find that to be quite comforting. So these experiences have also ultimately led me to where I am today and led me into a career of understanding the threats to our environment and how best to keep wild places alongside community partners wild. I currently conduct research at the University of Toronto, where I study multiple stressors, including climate change, chemical contaminants, and microplastics, and how these three things impact the kings of the north, otherwise known as Arctic char and lake trout. So when we think of the Arctic, what do we think of? We usually think of polar bears and ice, really, really cold weather. The Arctic is up above 66.5 degrees north, is above the Arctic Circle. It's almost entirely covered by water, and it holds 20% of the Earth's supply of fresh water. It's full of highly diverse and unique species. There are more than 21,000 highly cold adapted species in the Arctic, including a range of mammals, fish, birds, and invertebrates. And these species provide invaluable ecosystem services, not only to their local communities, but also for the peoples that live in the north. It's no secret that the Arctic is facing unprecedented environmental change as a result of climate change. It's experiencing an increase in temperature 2 to 3 times the rate as the rest of the globe, resulting in sea ice loss, habitat loss for a variety of animals, as well as diet changes and migratory changes. So this is from the IPCC 5th Climate Assessment Report, and the 6th this should be due out sometime this year. And here we can see that between the years of 1986 and 2005, we see a 1 to 2 degree change across the map, with 4 degrees at the poles here. That may not seem like a large difference to you or me, but to cold adapted species, that's a significant difference that can cause a great amount of stress. So the takeaway here is if we look at the left side of the screen and then look at the right side of the screen, we see a lot more red, meaning that it's going to get much hotter. And we also see a deep blue toward the poles, which also means that precipitation is going to increase. And the takeaway is the Arctic is experiencing and will continue to live through a hotter and wetter climate, which is significant. So this warming is causing a loss of sea ice coverage, and sea ice is not only a winter highway for many Arctic animals, but it also helps control our climate. Sea ice also traps contaminants that are in the Arctic, and with increased melt, a lot of these contaminants are being re-released or reintroduced into the system. Sticking with the idea of contaminants, polar ecosystems are not only stressed due to climate change, but they're also stressed due to contaminant exposure. This includes anything and everything from legacy chemicals or persistent organic pollutants, otherwise known as POPs, forever chemicals or PFOA, current use pesticides, and plastic pollution. And today we're going to talk about POPs and plastic pollution. So to top it all off, the interface between climate change, an increase in temperature, and contaminants is important, which we're going to dive into in a few minutes. So POPs are defined by the Stockholm Convention, and they are defined as synthetic chemicals that are persistent, pervasive, bioaccumulate, and toxic. These chemicals have been monitored over the last several decades through a variety of different institutions and international agreements, as well as a wide swath of researchers. There's a list of POPs that are currently regulated, as I mentioned, and although they are going down in concentration due to these strict regulations in use and manufacturing, we are seeing POPs be reintroduced to the system through melting ice, permafrost, and the emergence of new contaminants of concern like plastics. So by now you may be wondering, how do all of these contaminants and plastic pollution included get to the north? So the Arctic is considered a sink for contaminants, meaning that when chemicals or plastics get into the Arctic through a variety of different pathways, they often get stuck there. What goes into the Arctic often doesn't come out. So there are a variety of transport mechanisms and physical mechanisms that move contaminants into the north. One of these is atmospheric transport and being deposited into the north through snow, rain. Ocean currents can also transport contaminants to the north, as well as biological movements. So contaminants can be moved by animals or be introduced into the system through human activity. So when we talk about plastic pollution, we're referring to a variety of different types. There are large pieces of plastic we find in aquatic and terrestrial systems alike, such as single-use water bottles, plastic bags and straws, fishing nets, or ghost nets that have sunk their way to the bottom of our lakes and our oceans. These larger items are referred to as macroplastics. They're larger than 5 millimeters in size. Microplastics are a little bit of a different story. They come from a variety of sources. One is something I like to call the breakup. So the breakup is when larger pieces of plastic, like macroplastics, break up over time, whether it be from environmental weathering, UV degradation, accumulation of bacteria on the surface, etc. Eventually, these large pieces break up into small pieces of plastic, and these are what we call microplastics. There are a variety of other sources of microplastics aside from the breakup process. A few examples are nurdles, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, and these are small pre-production manufactured pellets that are melted down to form consumer goods that we all use and love and know in our homes. These are often spilled and make their way into our environment during the manufacturing process. Microbeads are small spherical beads found in personal care products. These end up in wastewater treatment plants. These are now banned in Canada, and I believe it's coming into effect in the US as well, but these are still quite present in our ecosystem. Fragments can be shed from boats and fishing equipment, and fibers are often shed from textiles, clothing, carpet, washing machines, things like this. So there are a variety of different sources that contribute to plastic from our own homes: tire dust, rubber, bottles, pellets, bags, fibers from our clothing. And while they have a variety of different sources, microplastics are also very complex and extremely diverse. We like to call them a complex suite of contaminants. What we see in the environment is very diverse, and it includes particles that have different polymer types, different additives, so the chemicals added to the plastic during production to give it a certain property, product types, films, fibers, things like this, insulation, mattresses, all that good stuff, They come in a variety of different sizes. So not only do we have macroplastics, we have microplastics, which are small, less than 5 millimeters, and then we have nanoplastics, which are really, really small. They change in shape, color, and toxins. So one thing to point out here is that not only do we have plastics that have chemical additives added in the ingredients that make up the piece of plastic at the manufacturing stage, but these pieces of plastic also can adsorb or adsorb environmental contaminants, which just means that the contaminants in the environment are able to stick to their surface, and then they're able to move and be transported with that piece of plastic. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the takeaway here is that plastics are really complex. They're not as simple as you would think. So in the Arctic, plastics have been identified in beaches, sediments, surface water, sea ice, and atmospheric deposition. Seabirds are one of the most studied organisms when it comes to plastic pollution. Both macro and microplastics have been identified in a range of Arctic seabirds and their habitats. Plastics have also been identified in the gastrointestinal tracts or the guts of beluga whales, polar cod, and bivalves like these blue mussels. So plastic pollution, specifically microplastics in this case, or in this example, can have a range of effects on animals that ingest it. So for example, on the screen here, we have what is called a Daphnia magna, otherwise known as a water flea. It is a small aquatic crustacean. And here on the left, you can see a normal gut. You see where it's black? That's what their guts are supposed to look like. Now these Daphnia have been fed particles, and we can see here that their guts are white, and that suggests that these particles are getting lodged into their gastrointestinal tract, and this affects their overall movement. And so when organisms like these have decreased mobility, we consider them, or can consider them, ecologically dead, which is a problem not only for their population as a species, but also ecosystem level effects due to the fact that they're an important food source for a variety of different animals. So this is just one example of how microplastic pollution can indeed affect aquatic organisms. Now, if we think back to the idea that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that plastics are complex, especially when it comes to their chemical cocktail due to the chemicals added when they're created and the chemicals that they can pick up when they're in the environment. We're going to unpack that a little bit more. So plastic pollution has both chemical ingredients, and it can interact with plastics in the environment. Plastics can then transport both the chemicals that are inherent to itself and also chemicals that may stick or adsorb to its surface. Plastics can also leach chemicals into the environment. Wildlife can then interact with plastics and their associated chemicals, and then these chemicals can be transferred to the animal. Plastics can then be retained and excreted. So this is something that is an underpinning of what my group does in terms of looking at what the impacts are of plastics as well as their associated chemical contaminants. Okay, so we just did a very fast crash course in 3 very big topics of interest in the Arctic. All 3 of these anthropogenic stressors, climate change, legacy contaminants or POPs, and plastic pollution have a range of biological impact. So just to recap here, we know that an increase in temperature can affect things like ice melt, wildlife migrations, food availability. We also know that POPs can impact organisms through physiological impacts such as endocrine disruption and reproductive function. We also know that macroplastics can cause entanglement and false satiation, meaning that when an animal eats a bunch of big pieces of plastic, it can feel full when in reality it's not full, and it needs to eat in order to get nutrition. But the biological impacts of macroplastics can include internal blockages, as well as this idea that there is some chemical toxicity that is potentially part of the microplastic question because of the complex chemical cocktail that it has. Okay, so what does this all mean, right? Environments are under multiple stressors all the time. And there in the Arctic, we have anthropogenic stressors like chemicals and microplastics. We also have environmental stressors that are sometimes caused by anthropogenic stress like climate change. And so we take these multiple stressors and we see how it impacts important species in order to understand how it can affect the ecosystem. And ultimately, the question really is what does this mean for local communities in the North, which is what we're going to talk about next. And this is really the underpinning of the work that I'm doing now, because in reality, it is the local community's home. We are trying tirelessly together to preserve and protect. So the majority of my work is done alongside community partners in Qeqertarsuaq and Iqaluit Nunavut, otherwise known as Cambridge Bay, with the addition of a few remote locations such as the Devon Ice Cap and the Prince of Wales Ice Field. So my work focuses on the 3 anthropogenic stressors that we just talked about: increasing temperature caused by climate change, POPs or legacy contaminants, and plastic pollution. Currently, the majority of my work focuses on Arctic char and lake trout in Cambridge Bay, which is a vital food source and economic source for the community. And on the eastern side of the Arctic, I work in Qeqertarsuaq on understanding the transport of plastics into the Arctic and within the Arctic by studying northern fulmars, which you can see in the top right corner. And this work is done in a wildlife area that is managed by the community of Qeqertarsuaq. So now I'm really fortunate to have been welcomed into both of these communities and work alongside community partners to achieve a shared goal. So ultimately, this work is driven by my local partners. These are the types of questions that we strive to understand as a team. How do microplastics enter and move through the Arctic? What are the effects of these 3 stressors on important Arctic species? And then ultimately, what does this mean for ecological health as well as country food and local communities? And as I said earlier, I think about it like this. Leave it there. I'm gonna go to the next slide. Okay, so my work in the North, everyone has a seat at the table and we work collectively to weave our knowledge together, both Inuit traditional knowledge and Western science. In order to understand the threat the Arctic faces, all stakeholders have to have a seat at the table and be provided the space to consult on research priorities and steps forward. So in the end, if we go back to this figure, the end goal really is to understand what the impacts are of these 3 stressors to both local ecosystems and communities. In order to do that effectively, communities have to have a seat at the table. And I'm very grateful to have the privilege to share a seat at their table and learn from them. Northern ecosystems are at risk, but so are the local communities. And ultimately, as a group, we are striving to understand what these environmental and ecological changes mean from both an ecological and local community standpoint. So now, before we move on to any questions, I like to end my talks with how we can play a part in being part of the solution. So we all have a part to play, and these are some steps that we can take in our own lives to prevent plastics from getting into our waterways and ultimately decrease the amount that ends up in the Arctic. Things like reducing our single plastic waste, adding washing machine filters to our washing machines to capture fibers before they end up in wastewater treatment plants. You conduct a shoreline cleanup in your local community, and also just be a citizen science. Educate yourself, educate others, and advocate for a clean environment. And so thank you so much for your attention. and I'm happy to take any questions.
If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Here's the first question. What is the normal amount of precipitation in the Arctic, and how much will it increase, and will it be snow or rain? That's from Caesar.
Hi, Caesar. That's a really great question. So if we go back here, I'm going to go back to this slide. Just give me just a second here. Okay, so if we look at this map here, on this bottom color key, this is a change in precipitation over time. So we can see here that projected by 2100, which is still pretty far away, but it's in terms of geologic time, in terms of how we think about our Earth and the climate, it's quite close. And we can see here that there's going to be around a 40 to 50% increase in the poles. And so likely this will be a lot of rain, more rain in the summer than they get normally. But yeah, that's a really great question. Okay, let's see here.
Oh, here. Do you have a book or documentary recommendations?
Sure. For plastics and like just generally, there are a couple of books that I'm blanking on the name of the actual title of the book at the moment. But with that being said, there are some really good books generally that talk about sort of science, the state of the science, where we're at the moment. And one book that I really like to recommend to people is The War on Science by Sean Otto. I think it gives you a lot of really historical perspective and current perspective on where we're at in terms of science and science informing policy and sort of how we got here. And I think that's a good book to start with. And then there are tons of books that deal with climate change and plastic pollution and Indigenous knowledge. One of my favorite books that I've read many times and I recommend to everyone who is interested in weaving together knowledge streams would be Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's a really, really excellent book as well.
Okay, let's see. What percentage of your work is conducting research in the field?
So I'll put it this way. My field season is usually oftentimes in the summer. So I'm in the north conducting research sometime in between, let's say, May and August. And then the other parts of my year are often spent in the lab analyzing the samples that I've collected. A big chunk of what I do is doing data analysis. So looking at trying to find patterns and trends in the data we've collected. And then another big part of my job is community consultations. So we try to go up as often as we are able to go and attend community meetings and governmental board meetings and things like that in the communities that we work in, to have those community consultations and talk about, plans for the future, project updates, concerns, things like this.
Another, Donna Mata asks, Braiding Sweetgrass, was that the name of the book?
Yes.
Okay. And then Raul asks, what are things fourth graders can do to help? Oh, that's from Dana of Lowry Elementary. So what are things fourth graders can do to help?
That's a great question. So I might have you send out a couple of links or put them in the comments for the YouTube video once it's done. But so as part of my work at the University of Toronto, I guess I can stop sharing my screen and you can see my face instead. as part of my work at the University of Toronto, I'm a member of the University of Toronto trash team, and we have developed a whole slew of not only education materials, but also home waste audits. So I'll make sure that we put the link on the YouTube channel in the comments or something. But doing a home waste audit, there's lots of opportunities and sort of directions online that you can do for that. But it's a great way to get, grade 4 students to audit the amount of waste that we produce at home. It's a really great sort of family activity, and you learn a lot about how much waste we as individuals sort of put out there on a weekly basis. So that's a great way to educate ourselves, and then also just I think it's really great to have those conversations with your parents as well as parents with your kids about environmental stewardship and decreasing the amount of plastic waste that we use when we're at school in grade 4 or up until grade 12. Right? When you're at school, don't take plastic cutlery in the lunchroom. Little things like that can make a really big difference.
Thank you. Here's the next question. Are there assistant opportunities for citizens? Field assistant. Are there field assistant?
Yeah, so there are tons of opportunities that come up through different programs for high school. Often it's usually for high school students, like internships and things like this that can be done with. There's some federal ones that are done through NOAA or Fish and Wildlife. I would also encourage you, if you have students or kids that are interested in participating in those types of things, I'd reach out to your local Department of Natural Resources or Fish and Game headquarters or local establishment for those types of organizations. They often have a lot of really great programs to get kids involved.
What do you think was your greatest impact growing up that led you to this field?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think overall, I think it's the culmination of just how I was raised, I guess. I attribute a lot of this to my parents. As a kid, I spent all my time outside. They'd have to beg me to come in. I'd come home with bugs and peanut butter jars and be really interested in that sort of thing. I went and they really indulged that type of behavior. But we would go fishing all this, on weekends. We do a lot of camping trips. And my parents too, I think, are very environmentally minded, I guess, and aware. And so I think sort of the culminations of these experiences over time, especially when I was a kid, really, really made me love the outdoors. And ultimately that led me to really want to understand what threats it faces and then, how we can protect it.
Thank you. Here is the next question. Can we tell which animals are more endangered due to microplastics? And that's from Diego.
Hi, Diego. That's a great question. I think it's a complicated answer. I think in terms of which animals are more there are animals that are certainly more susceptible to eating plastics. And so we still have to find out the answers to those questions. We don't necessarily know. We do know, for example, like seabirds are very susceptible to eating plastic. But there's a lot left to learn and sort of what that means in the grand scheme of things.
Here is the next one. How many pieces of plastic are there in the ocean? And that's from Lily of Lowry Elementary.
Lily, that's the $1,000,000 question. We have no idea. We do have some idea of how much is being put into the ocean and emitted. But in terms of how much is in the ocean, that's the $1,000,000 question. We don't know.
And then here's the next question. Is there a way we can help to clean the ocean? And that's from Miguel of Lowry Elementary.
Hi, Miguel. That's a great question. That's also another $1,000,000 question. So I'm going to answer it in this way. There are many ways that we as individuals and members of our community can decrease the amount of plastics that are going into our oceans. And I think that's the key to making our oceans cleaner, is to catch it before it ends up there. And that's the same thing goes for our rivers and our lakes and our Great Lakes, any body of water, and the terrestrial environment. Let's also not forget about the terrestrial environment. And so actions and mitigation actions to decrease the amount of plastic going into our environment is one way that we're going to be able to do that. And then the next way is policy change. We need better ways to recycle. We need better waste infrastructure in order to handle the amount of waste that we produce. And then ultimately, if we take these types of steps, we'll be able to decrease the amount that's ending up in our environment. I wish I had a way I could snap my fingers and all the plastics would be gone out of the ocean and out of our environment. But it's just not that simple, unfortunately. I agree, Donna.
Okay.
Yes, a great deal of national defense funds. A comment was a great deal of national defense funds should go into ocean and water cleanup. And that's a great comment. There are there was a paper that just came out recently, actually, that talks about the need globally. So something along the lines of like an IPCC, but for waste and chemical contaminants in waste production and infrastructure. And so there's a push sort of, regionally in some areas and also internationally to have these sort of working groups that really move forward with the interface between, global policy and science in terms of dealing with, chemical contaminants and waste. So yeah, it's getting a lot of attention, and I think it's a growing aspect of this work for sure.
What advice would you have to young children, like the students that are in the 4th grade class that are watching? I think there are a couple of classes watching right now. What advice would you give to them if they are interested in studying this field of science?
So regardless of what field you want to study in science or whatever field you want to go into, I would encourage you to always ask why. As a scientist, I get to ask questions for a living, which I think is a lot of fun. And being curious about the world around you and the environment around you and how things work, or why something doesn't work, or why it maybe should work in a different way. I would encourage you to really pursue those types of questions and stay curious and always ask questions, because you never know where it will end up.
How much math do you use in your job? How much mathematics? And what would you say to kids that might be a little bit afraid of math?
So I use a lot of math, not as much as some people, but in order to find patterns in our data, and look for trends and things like this, we use a lot of statistics. And that statistics and math, I think, is sometimes a scary word, but it's not. And when I was a kid, I used to be a little bit intimidated by math. But I would encourage you to remember that, when you're in grade school and high school, you're building that foundation for the main areas of study, right? Like math and science and English and things like this. And then once you get further along in your education, you can really start to, specialize and pick out the relevant topics out of that foundation, right? And start to build upon that foundation you've gotten at your, early on in your education. And so with that being said, I would just don't be afraid of it. It's not scary. Math is really useful. And it's something that regardless of what you go into when you get older, it's always going to be something that you're going to use in some capacity.
Thank you. How can we convince people to stop wasting and save the world? That's from Julietta of Lowry Elementary.
Julietta, that's an excellent question. That's a great question. And I think first of all, I think having a conversation about these topics is really important. There is a climate scientist who was part of the National Biodiversity Teach-In last week, I think, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who is one of the world's renowned climate scientists. And she always says that we need to talk about climate change. And I think the same can be applied to chemical contaminants and plastic pollution, and talk about not only, how it affects our ecosystem, but what we can do. And I do think I'm a strong believer in that small changes over time, if a lot of people are making those small changes, add up. And so we all have our part to play. So to have those conversations and educate yourself and, take those small steps that we're able to really make a difference.
Thank you. Here is another question. How many new animals are being put on the endangered species list? And that's from Uriel of Lowry Elementary.
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. But I can find out the answer, and we can maybe send your teacher the answer or put it in a comment. But I don't have the answer. I don't know. It's a really good question.
Okay, this next question is from So Many Questions on the YouTube channel. Do you like studying the cause and effect of things, or how structure and function are linked?
That's a good question. I'm an ecotoxicologist, so I will say that I do like studying the cause and effect of things. I really like trying to pick apart the details and the reasons why, plastic pollution, for example, creates some sort of adverse effect on a fish. Same thing goes for chemical contaminants. But yeah, I think that cause and effect. Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question. How has COVID affected your work?
Well, it's affected it a little bit. I will say that I'm fortunate in that I have, the ability to be flexible. And so I am working from home. The lab is open, but it's functioning at minimal capacity. So I am able to go in a couple days a week for a few hours only during, a certain period of time. And my field seasons I've been unable to travel north to the communities that I work with. And so in order to combat those issues, we've implemented and been able, because of our relationships with our community members, or community collaborators, excuse me, we've been able to implement community-based sampling efforts, and have those types of programs running, which still allows us to monitor these ecosystems and get the samples that we need. But yeah, it definitely has delayed some progress, but I will say it has definitely given us some perspective, and remember, some of the important things in life.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. Here's the next one. Were you ever part of 4-H? That comes from Donna Mata.
That's a really good question. You know what? I was not. Yeah, no, I was not.
How can I donate and help? That's from Lily of Lowry Elementary.
Lily, that's so nice and so sweet of you. There are a few places that I would suggest donating to. One is the Ocean Conservancy. They do a lot of really, really phenomenal work in terms of raising awareness and education, as well as helping fund really important research, not only in plastics, but a wide variety of topics.
Thank you. Here is the next one. What will happen if all the turtles become extinct? And that's from Geraldine of Lowry Elementary.
Geraldine, that's a great question. I'm not a turtle expert, so I don't have a great answer for you. But I will say that turtles are really important species in their ecosystems. And when we remove those really important species, which we call keystone species, when we remove those from the ecosystem, we have really, really big detrimental effects to other species in that ecosystem. So I would suspect that we would have some very large issues from an ecosystem standpoint. But again, I'm not a turtle expert.
I have a couple questions that have been texted to me now. Why is your work important?
That's a great question. This is a little bit of biased answer, I guess, but our environment is under a lot of stress, and a lot of it is human induced or human caused, right? Mm-hmm. And so everything is a quote I'm trying to pull out of my deep, dark corners of my brain. But everything's connected, right? And so when we start to stress out multiple components of an ecosystem, we start to see some really big effects. And we live, on this planet. It's the only home we have. And the earth would do fine without us. We would not do fine without the earth. So I think from a very personal standpoint, I have an obligation as a person to do my very best to leave this planet in better shape than it was when I entered it. And so that's a big part of my work in trying to understand these problems and then also trying to figure out what we can do about it. From an individual standpoint, but also a policy standpoint, and use really good science, integrate it with policy in order to make meaningful change.
So how do the people of the world support you, the work that you're doing, and people like you that are doing your work? How can we support you?
That's a really great question. I think that all of us doing our own, our part and being part of the solution, whether that's, not getting, when you get takeout, bring your own dishes, like small things like that we probably don't even think of, we don't think about on a daily basis. I think that's one way that we can help this work move forward. And another way is really to educate yourselves, to educate the people around you, and have those conversations, those tough conversations about climate change and the stress that our environment faces. I think those are really two tangible steps that each of us can implement in our own lives, that will make a meaningful difference as time moves forward.
In science education, we are using science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts. And one of those is modeling. As a scientist, how do you use modeling in your work?
That's a good question. So there's a few ways that we can use, that my field specifically, and what I do can use modeling. And that's when we are trying to understand trends, and trying to understand trends of contaminants, into the future, to project and use models based on current data, and data that we have, and then sort of trying to understand those trends and then project what could potentially happen under different scenarios. To be honest, I look at a lot of modeling and I read a lot of papers that talk about modeling. I don't do a whole lot of it, but there definitely are fields that use a lot of modeling. There's several people, colleagues of mine in the department, that use mathematical modeling to understand how we can ecosystem dynamics, how species interact, as well as how things of how we can prevent coral bleaching and things like this. So I may not do a lot of it, but it's definitely present in the field of ecology.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Here is the next question, and this is from Donna Mata. Do you think we are seeing improvement since conservancy has been addressed, or are we now just trying to gain traction with awareness?
I think I'm trying to not be all doom and gloom. I do think we've made progress. I do think that we still have a lot of progress ahead of us. And part of that progress is making people aware, both, in our small circles and also at a policy standpoint as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And this is from Geraldine of Lowry Elementary. At what age did you become interested in what you do?
Ooh, it's a good one. Well, I think as a kid, I love fish. I think anything that lives in water is really interesting. And I was very, very into that when I was a kid. I wanted nothing more in the world to become a marine biologist and work with beluga whales. I'm not that far off, but I'm not doing that. And so that was always that was what I wanted to be when I grew up. Very specific. And as I got older, finished high school and then went to college or university, I really, really decided that I really enjoy trying to understand that cause and effect thing, right? Like there's a fish or a population of fish that's really sick. Why? And what's causing it? And so trying to understand those relationships is what really got me into the field of toxicology, and specifically environmental and ecotoxicology.
The interesting thing is you are the third scientist who has told the audience that they started with an interest in marine biology, and none of them ended up in that area. Why do you have any reason why that might be?
No, I don't. I mean, I know a lot of marine biologists and they have some pretty awesome jobs, I have to say.
Right.
But I do think, I mean, at least for me, I really like trying to understand the contaminant side of things and how that affects organisms. And so, although I am not a marine biologist studying, the movements of beluga whales, I do get to work in the north. I do get to see beluga whales. They're my favorite animal. And, I do get to sort of dip into marine biology a little bit just from a different angle.
Do you have a favorite experience that you've had since you've been doing this job out in the field? Do you have a favorite experience or something that just has stuck in your mind?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple, but broadly speaking, I love my field season. I get to camp out. If you like camping, I love camping. And we're out far away from town. We get taken out by a float plane in a small beaver float plane, and it lands on the water. And we unpack our stuff from the plane, tents, lots of tents, sleeping tents, and then sampling tents. And then we're just out in the middle of nowhere for a couple of weeks doing our sampling. And it is first of all, it's absolutely beautiful. And it's quite challenging at times, which I find to be one of the great parts I love about it. And, when working with our local partners that come out with us, the times at field camp are times I think that I'll just always have with me.
Thank you. Here is our next question, and this is from Dana. When did plastic start becoming such a problem?
Dana, that's a really good question. So one of the first, I'm going to talk about specifically the Arctic, but we started finding plastic in seabirds in Alaska in the 1980s, which, if you're in elementary school, was long before you were born. And so over the last 40 years, there has been an increase in scientific interest, I think, and really starting to try to understand the plastic problem. But I think a lot where it all started was back in the 50s when the idea of single-use plastic items in our households, like plates and silverware and things like this, became really prominent. And so I think that is one of the tipping points to where single-use plastics in our own lives became really, really, really common. And then eventually there's, we don't have the waste infrastructure and recycling processes to deal with that. And so then a lot of it ends up in our environment. So it's been a couple of decades that this has been known about, and it's really come to the forefront, I would say, of science in the last 15 years.
Thank you. Here is another question. Are there animals that are able to survive by eating plastic? And that comes from Miguel of Lowry.
Miguel, that's a really good question. So we are starting to learn that some animals are attracted to plastic to eat it. And it's sort of unclear what the mechanism for that is or why they do that. But they're never, animals aren't going to get the nutrition they need if they just eat a diet of plastic. So I would venture to say that the answer to your question is ultimately no. There are animals that, for whatever reason, whether it's the smell or the taste, are attracted to that. But are they going to be able to survive and sustain a healthy life off of that? I don't think so.
Thank you. Donna is asking us if you have an email that you can be reached at.
I do. Can I type an answer? Yes, I can.
Yes. Mhm.
Donna, I'm typing it in the chat. And you can contact me with any questions. I'm happy to chat. I'm happy to help.
And then let's see. Alexia asks, why is it important to save the fish?
Why is it important to save the fish? That's a great question. So for this, a lot of the fish that I work with and generally are really important parts of the ecosystem. So similar to the sea turtle answer, if we have really important species that are on a steep decline or completely removed, it has cascading effects or impacts on the rest of the ecosystem. And it's quite tough to regain traction after those types of things happen. So we want to try and prevent, ultimately, we want to try and prevent species from going extinct, whether it's fish or, polar bears. There's ultimately, it'd be great if we can just prevent all of that. But it's important to save parts of the ecosystem that we can.
Do these microplastics find their way into our food?
That's a great question. Yes, we do know that seafood that we eat, has plastics in it. There's some more studies on sort of the atmospheric or the fallout, I guess, of dust in our house that may land on food. So if you've ever looked out your window when the sun is coming through and you see all that like dust particulate that shines when the sun hits it just right, we're finding that a lot of that is actually microplastics. And so we are definitely exposed through our food and things like this, for sure.
Great. Thank you very much. You have answered so many of our questions here today and taught us so much about microplastics. Are there any more questions before we say goodbye? Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I hope that you'll join us again next year for the National Biodiversity Teach-In.
Thank you, Frankie. It was such a pleasure to be here as always. Thank you all for listening and your awesome questions. As I said earlier, I would just remind you to stay curious and enjoy the outdoors. And thank you again so much.
Very good advice for everyone. Thank you very much.